Lost in time, a case resurfaces. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Comment where you're tuning in. Your voices enrich this journey. Let's uncover the truth. It was in that curiously suspended season between winter and spring, when London's fog seems to hesitate at the very panes, as if uncertain whether to press its chill advantage or dissolve into drizzle, that a matter reached us which would have discomfited a less exacting intelligence than my friend's. Holmes had just concluded, to the satisfaction of an American steel magnate and the severe disappointment of a certain theatrical press agent, his analysis of a disputed signature, an affair that left the drawing-room table at Baker Street speckled with iron filings and my own, patience coated with them, when Inspector Lestrade presented himself with the grim anxiety which so often presaged the singular. "You have a way, Mr. Holmes," said he, scarcely pausing to warm his gloved hands at the fire, "of finding mischief where the rest of us see inconveniences. I'll trouble you to find some this morning." "You flatter me, Lestrade," Holmes returned, with that thin smile which could be as kind as it was sardonic. "But it is you who carry the mischief. Pray sit. Watson, if you will move that retort—" "No, the other, thank you. Now then, what has Scotland Yard mislaid? Her murder, or something most infernally like it, in Red Lion Square. But it isn't the corpse that's the riddle, Mr. Holmes, it's the clocks." "The clocks?" I repeated. "All of them," Lestrade said, nodding toward our mantel where a modest French carriage timepiece ticked with its complacent domestic emphasis. Stopped. And at the same minute, Holmes's long, nervous fingers, which had been idly combing the filings into a neat crescent, came to rest. "All? You are not dealing with a reputable clockmaker, Inspector. If he allows his fleet to mutiny together, the man was a clockmaker." "Sir," Lestrade returned, rather disconcerted to find his thunder forestalled. "Mr. Josiah Whitlock by name. A retired chronometer maker with contracts once to the Admiralty, so they say. He is dead, peacefully by appearances, in his armchair, the door barred from within, the windows set fast, and every clock and watch in the house, from an 8-day long case to a child's toy, standing at 13 minutes past 1. 13, murmured Holmes. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. The fog pressed its greasy face against the window, as though straining to hear. "And upon what day did time strike its flag?" "Last night, as near as we can tell," said Lestrade. "The maid left at 9. The old fellow never sat late. The milkman this morning raised the alarm when no one answered the area bell. We forced the door. There sits Mr. Whitlock with a rug across his knees, a book fallen at his side, and clocks that ought to have drowned London Bridge in chime at the hour, all silent at 1:13. It is unusual," Holmes conceded, though in such a tone as might have greeted a comet's passage. "If you will allow us a hansom's head start over your men, Inspector, I should like to see these rebellious timekeepers, while they are yet in their fright." Lestrade's face brightened with relief. "I thought as much. They're securing the place now. If you please, gentlemen." 10 minutes later we were clattering along in a hansom through a city that had wrapped itself like an invalid in its own fog. I confess to a certain thrill at the inspector's account, for I have always harboured a physician's affection for order, and there is no order so comforting as that of a faithful watch. To wreck it wholesale seemed a crime against nature herself. Red Lion Square, as we found it, had taken on that peculiar quiet which the police impart to a neighbourhood merely by standing in it. A pair of uniformed constables kept the curious at bay, while in the doorway of a neat brick-fronted house a sergeant saluted Lestrade. Within, the air carried a faint odour of oil and something sharper, a metallic tang not unlike that which lingers in a surgery after the use of certain cauterizing instruments. The front parlour was an emporium of time. No wall was unoccupied. No table was innocent of some mechanism to parcel out the hours. On the hearth, a brass-faced long case, its mahogany gleaming under the polish of decades, stared at us with a moon-phased dial painted a deep lapis. On the opposite wall, 2 regulator clocks maintained a severe and mutual surveillance, and along the mantel, snug as a row of soldiers, stood carriage clocks and bracket clocks, and one little German toy with a painted shepherd who I presume emerged on occasion to harass a lamb with a stick. They were all in accord, eerily so, each at 13 minutes past 1, each with its second hand caught in a different fraction of the sweep, like a roomful of men with their breath held at different depths. In an armchair by the window, covered to the shins by a rug in which I observed 2 burned holes, sat Mr. Josiah Whitlock. He had been, one could see, a spare man in life. Death had not diminished him. The head had fallen forward upon the chest, and the right hand, which lay upon the chair's arm, was stained along the thumb and forefinger with a soot-like smear. On a small table at his elbow lay an open volume of Whitaker's Almanac. The page turned to the tables of the tides and eclipses. Her cheap Waterbury watch, of the sort I had seen in railway carriages, lay face down as if flung aside, its mainspring still sounding a dull, intermittent burr. Holmes did not go to the body at once. He paused upon the threshold, the nostrils slightly dilated, his eyes taking in the whole with that comprehensive glance which sees not only objects but their relations. Then he crossed the rug at 2 light steps and touched the edge of the long case-weight with a forefinger. "Do not move anything, if you please," he said to Lestrade over his shoulder, though the inspector had made no such motion. "Watson, do you note the dust?" I looked. The weight's polished lead belly wore a faint half-moon, where dust had lately been displaced. At the base of the case, some grey powder had gathered in a crescent upon the parquet. "It has been raised and lowered," I ventured. "Raised," said Holmes, "and then arrested." He bent, peered along the floor, and with the tongs he presently drew out from beneath the case a crumpled wedge of newsprint. He spread it delicate as a surgeon's compress. "The Evening Standard, Tuesday last. But the murder was last night," Lestrade objected. Holmes's eyes slid to the regulators. "It is well when timepieces keep time," he murmured, "and better when they keep secrets." He moved to the dead man's hand and sniffed, then turned the thumb gently with his pencil. "Soot, yes, but not the coal of your kitchen, Inspector. Lamp-black and something of sulphur, no. Not sulphur, ozone." He raised his head, listening, as if to an echo only he could hear. A constable, acting upon Lestrade's nod, went to the window and struggled with the sash. "Fast, sir, and painted besides." Holmes waved him back. "Pray do not bruise it. The paint is late, this week at most." He examined the sill, then the frame. "And a hair, horsehair, no silk. He drifted next to the mantel. From among the little herd of carriage clocks, he selected one whose glass was so clear as to have nearly no existence, and pressed the catch. It opened upon the sweetest innards one could imagine, jewels that peeped like berries, the coiled ribbon of the mainspring, the straight fine bones of the escapement, yet a dusting of bright grit clung to the pivot. "Groundstone," he said, half to himself. "Not emery. Corundum." He offered me the speck upon his fingernail. "Sapphire ground, Watson. You will have seen such in a jeweller's vice. And here," he touched a second clock, "iron filings." Lestrade, who had been watching this survey with growing impatience, at last burst out, "You will tell me, Mr. Holmes, if the man was killed or merely died with a sense of drama about him." "Doctor," I had taken the liberty to feel the dead man's wrist and to peer beneath the lid, lifting it with professional respect. The pupils were somewhat contracted, the nails not discoloured, the features tranquil. The mouth was closed, yet a trace of a brownish dryness at the corners struck me as odd. His breath tube showed no obstruction. There was no sign of struggle upon the wrists or neck. The heart, of course, told me nothing. "There is nothing to suggest violence," said I. "A stroke is possible, yet the hands are not clenched, and the posture is not the common one. The rug is singed here," I added, indicating the 2 neat holes as if sparks had fallen. "But from what source? From a small battery, perhaps," Holmes said absently, stooping to inspect the Waterbury watch. He held it to his ear, frowned, shook it once, and put it down with distaste. This never belonged to Mr. Whitlock. He would no more have allowed such an inaccuracy in his pocket than a navvy would lace violets in his boots. And yet his watch is not here. Lestrade pounced. Not here. Then we have a robbery. If so, Holmes replied, the thief had a singular conscience, for he has left untouched, he indicated with the pencil, a gold bracket clock worth 50 guineas and a marine chronometer worth also. He has, however, taken the one instrument which would have told us the precise hour of Mr. Whitlock's departure from this world. The watch is absent. The clocks are silenced. The long-case weight is arrested by a newspaper, half a week old, and someone has powdered a pivot with ground sapphire. Really, Lestrade, he is doing my work for me. Then you see it? The inspector demanded. You know who did it? Holmes's smile became distant. I know perhaps what has not been done. That is a beginning. Tell me, did Mr. Whitlock receive visitors? The maid says he kept to himself. But we found 2 teacups washed and set to drain, and the hearthrug shows marks of something heavy dragged, a box, we think. There's a scorch on the boards beneath the chair, as the doctor pointed out, and this— He produced from his pocket a small visiting card, its edges slightly singed. It was on the table, half under the almanac. Holmes took it without comment. Upon the card, in the fine copper plate of a professional stationer, were the initials E.C., and below them an address in Holborn, which meant nothing to me. Holmes turned it over to the blank side and sniffed it, as a hound will the air. Violet ink, he said, and a woman's. The card was cut with a dull blade. Note the burr. A cheap tray then, and bulk ordered. E.C. But initials are the laziest of masks. He slipped the card into his pocketbook, and at last, with a sigh that was nearly human in its regret for the ordinary, took Whitlock's head gently between his hands. He smelled the hair, examined the ears, lifted the chin, and peered along the line of the jaw. So, he said softly, and set the head back upon the breast. So what? I could not help exclaiming. So, he repeated, Mr. Whitlock may have died at 1:13 by some person's reckoning, but by his own he died at 2 minutes past 12. Lestrade stared. You can't mean— I mean only, said Holmes, that when time forgets it is usually because someone has induced amnesia. He stood, his manner suddenly brisk. Inspector, you will oblige me by keeping this room undisturbed. No clocks are to be wound, no glass wiped, no rug taken up. Send a man to the address upon this card, but he is to ask questions of the neighbours only. Watson, my hat. I must make a brief call in Holborn, and a shorter one in Fleet Street. If I am right, the city's great heart will give its answer not in words, but in the beat it keeps for Greenwich. Greenwich. Lestrade's bafflement deepened. Greenwich, Holmes said, already moving, for there is the one sovereign to which all these playthings bow. When that sovereign's proclamation is delayed, his eyes went once more to the arrested second hands. All the town stumbles. Come, Watson. And just then, before we reached the threshold, there came a hard rap at the street door and a messenger's call in a boy's clear treble. Telegram for Mr. Whitlock. Immediate! The boy stood on the threshold with his cap in his hands, and a look that blended importance with fright. Holmes, who could move with pantherine speed when a thread presented itself, had the envelope in his fingers before Lestrade had reached his own breast pocket. For Mr. Josiah Whitlock, the lad chirped again, though rather faintly under Holmes's gaze. The office said immediate. Holborn or Charing Cross? Holmes asked, turning the flap to feel the gum. Nay, don't trouble. Your boots have the black grit of Shoe Lane upon them, and your wire cut had the dust of pasteboard, which is the certain mark of the Fleet Street sorting room. The message is from the Central Telegraph Office. The boy's mouth fell open. Yes, sir. Holmes slit the envelope with his thumb. The blue slip within bore in the telegraph clerk's precise hand the following brief absurdity. Time will fail at 13, observe. E.C. He held it to the light, then to his nose. Clerkly hand, Watson. But the original was composed in violet, and bears a trace of musk. A woman gave in the message, Inspector, yet it is countersigned with those same obliging initials. When was it lodged? Lestrade peered. Stamped 12/16 today. Too late for prophecy and too early for gallows wit, Holmes murmured. You did well to bring it straight. Boy, you have earned your shilling. Take this and return with my compliments to your office. You will ask whether any message for Mr. Whitlock was taken in last night between 1 o'clock and 2, and whether the Greenwich time signal was reported regular. If they object, say Mr. Sherlock Holmes desires it run. The boy fled, clasping his windfall. Holmes slid the telegram into his pocketbook beside the singed card, and turned once more in a slow circle, gathering the room's tale as one gathers spilled beads. Inspector, you see now why I beg you let the clocks lie. They speak yet. Watson, the silk thread caught at the painted sash. Note that it crosses a smear of fresh varnish and vanishes between the two frame pieces, a telltale to discover whether the window had been raised. It is untorn, yet the paint is new. Someone sealed his stage and then delighted to show it sealed. That's what I say, Lestrade returned, obstinacy armoring his bewilderment. A locked room and a dead man. If you have a villain to put in it, I'll clap irons on him. In time, said Holmes lightly. But first, I will borrow a fraction of your authority. You will leave P.C. Bradshaw at the door and allow no one to pass, save me and my companion. Then you will go, if you are wise, to the Holborn address upon the card, and ask the neighbours if they have seen any person of late going in and out, tall, 33, with a hat too new and a coat too old, who smells faintly of paraffin. The name upon the bell will not be E.C. It will be something solid but unmemorable, Smith or Brown, and the man himself will deny you with too much courtesy. If he offers you tea, do not take it. Lestrade made a face, half vexation, half grudging trust. Very well, but you'll share whatever you find. I shall share what you can use, Holmes returned, with that dry twinkle which could irritate a saint. Come, Watson. We are bound for Fleet Street and thence to Holborn. When a dead man's clocks stop together, it is the living city that gives the reason. Outside the fog had thickened into a fine rain, which silvered the hansom's apron and set the lamps to haloing like moons in a fairy tale. Holmes sat forward, his thin profile cut black against the street's pale glare, and drummed the telegram upon his knee in a rhythm that set my own thoughts to racing. You saw, of course, he said presently, the crescent of dust upon the long case weight. I did. You said it was raised and arrested. Just so. Any clock will confess if you press it. Our friend wedged the weight as one might a theatre curtain, to freeze the scene at his chosen tableau. But he overplayed his hand in two particulars. The newspaper is dated Tuesday, showing us the rehearsal, and the carriage clock's pivot wore fresh corundum. He had trouble with that one. He dressed the jewel to make it run down at his hour, but the abrading left grit enough for my nose. And the iron filings? Holmes looked pleased. A magnetized escapement, my dear fellow. It is the vice of the sloppy electrician. A sufficient field near the balance, and your innocent watch becomes a sulky mule. Note the ozone about the chair and the burns in the rug. A small induction coil stood there. He lured Whitlock to sit, perhaps to admire some trifling demonstration. See, sir, how science sets even a toy to keep the king's time. And while he entertained, he touched with a wire here and there, coaxing a stoppage. He had, too, a serviceable battery, which sputters and stinks if you are in haste. You make an afternoon's vandalism of it, I protested. But why all this elaborate theatre? Holmes's fingers ceased their drumming. Because the manner is the message. Mr. Whitlock was an artist of ours. He made the Admiralty's faith sure by the regularity of his chronometers. What finer irony to write on his epitaph than that time his sovereign betrayed him? Our phantom wishes the world to believe that time failed at 13. He tapped the telegram. Observe. The hansom swung into the glare and clamour of Fleet Street. Holmes paid off the driver at the great office, whose brass plates and ceaseless clatter made a kind of secular cathedral. Within, the counters were a bustle of clerks and messengers. Above, on a gallery, the instrument needles fluttered and ticked like a flock of nervous birds. Holmes's card worked miracles. The superintendent, a man with a black beard so clean one could see the barber's line upon his cheek, answered his inquiries with dry precision. No, there had been no irregularity in the Greenwich signal. The observatory had pulsed the 1 o'clock impulse upon the second. Yes, a message for Mr. Whitlock had been lodged last night at 12 minutes past 1 by a lady in a heavy veil. The clerk remembered the peculiar violet ink. The wording? The superintendent consulted the register and read it out, identical to that we had received, save that it lacked the word observe. It had not been delivered because the messenger, meeting a constable at Red Lion Square in the morning, was told the house was under police seal. Holmes's eyes shone. You see, Watson, the play had 2 acts. Last night, the lady sent the rumour by wire at 1:12 to be delivered to a man she knew would not receive it. This morning the same hand, or one in league, redoubled the jest. Time will fail at 13, observe. We have obliging enemies. They force us to the heart. And the heart is Greenwich, I said, catching a glimmer of his thought. The heart is the habit by which London lives, he returned. Greenwich is its brain. Come, Holborn. We dismissed the superintendent with thanks and made for the address on the singed card. It proved a narrow house set between a cheap lithographer and a dealer in marine lamps. A modest brass plate upon the door announced, more by afterthought than pride, E.C. and Cummerser, electrical chronometry. Holmes's mouth made a shape that was not a smile. Too simple, I murmured. Too simple by half, he agreed. He touched the bell. It gave no sound. He tried the handle. The door yielded an inch and checked against a chain. A man's voice came muffled from within. We are not receiving today. Holmes's tone turned at once languid and ineffectual, the voice of a clerk newly entrusted with errands. A trifle only. Mr. Whitlock begs you will return him the marine chronometer he promised to examine. A pause. Something, feet or the weighting of a floorboard, shifted just beyond the chain. I smelled a stale sweetness. Mr. Whitlock is not known to us, said the voice. Good morning? As you please, Holmes murmured, and in that murmur I heard the scratch of a match in his mind. His eyes, which had been idle, now saw everything. The smear of violet on the door's inner edge where a careless hand had steadied itself, the faint glitter on the stair carpet of iron dust, the mark at the bell plate, where a wire had lately been drawn and reattached. He let the door fall shut with an apology so meek it might have passed for defeat. Watson, he said softly as we withdrew to the pavement, you will make a note. Violet ink, musk, iron filings, paraffin, a bell that rings to nothing, and a man who, when faced with an unexpected name, moves not backwards in surprise but forward to listen. We shall return. But first I must borrow a page from his book. If one would cause time to fail at 13, one must persuade it of a different noon. I shall call upon a friend in the Strand, who keeps a certain master clock. You meanwhile will be so good as to write a prescription for the inspector, for Lestrade, for Patience. He tucked the telegram deeper into his pocket, and his voice warmed an inch. Our adversary has given us his initials upon a tray, his trade upon his door, and his vanity in a jest. Vanity, Watson, is the one gear that never fails. I mean to set it spinning. Holmes led me at a pace which would have scandalized my old drill sergeant to a narrow doorway in the Strand, over which a modest sign announced, Hartigan and Sons, Electrical Time and Telegraphy. Within, the air was bright with polished brass and alive with that small, insectile mutter, which belongs to relay arms and galvanometers. A lean gentleman with cuffs as immaculate as his moustaches greeted my friend with an enthusiasm which told me at once that Mr. Hartigan, too, had profited by Holmes's acquaintance. The master clock still keeps your conscience. I trust, Holmes said, shaking hands. I require a favour that will be a test of your diplomacy. First, were your receivers regular at 1 o'clock last night? Mr. Hartigan inclined his head with that gravity which precise men accord to precise questions. Greenwich beat the seconds like a metronome, Mr. Holmes. Here are the traces. He produced a strip of smoked paper along which a stylus had scratched a neat cardiogram of time. I saw at once where the thicker downstroke of the minute impulse marked 1 o'clock with machine-like certainty. Nothing that should have stopped an honest clock. Excellent. Now the favour. Holmes's voice softened, and his eyes flicked to the little blackboards upon which notices to the trade were chalked for the runners to carry. Delays upon the suburban lines. A request from a watchmaker in Bloomsbury for No. 00 pivot wire. An inquiry whether any gentleman had spare fusee chain. You will be so good as to add quietly and without fuss that an anomalous retardation has been remarked upon certain private circuits at 113. Mechanicians are requested to report irregularities. You will also send, by your Fleet Street boy, a message to the address I shall write, naming an hour at which Mr. Hartigan begs the honour of a call. Hartigan looked puzzled, but in no way unwilling. You think someone will bite? I think, Holmes returned, that a gentleman who has persuaded himself he could make time fail will not resist a chance to instruct those who truly keep it. Pride, my dear sir, is the ratchet which prevents the back-turning of folly. Your blackboard will set it clicking. He scribbled upon a card which Hartigan took. At 3, Holmes added, I shall have the back shop in Holborn under my eye. If a messenger stirs there upon receipt of your line, I fancy he will move with the gait of a man who hurries to collect undeserved laurels. We came out once more to the Strand's noisy artery. Holmes bought from a curbside hawker a pair of stained leather gauntlets, and from a brazier boy a length of soot-smudged wire. The gasboard man is next to the dustman, the only unchallenged inquisitor in London, he observed, drawing the gloves on and scuffing a smear of ash across his cheekbone. You, Watson, will be my clerk, whose pen runs only when my tongue dictates. If I knock thrice, you will fetch Lestrade. Twice you will make your cough sound like an omnibus. There is art even in coughing. Our return to Holborn was blessed by a stroke of chance that Holmes accepted as if he had ordered it. Lestrade met us at the corner with his hat pushed back and his mouth short of breath. She's been and gone, he blurted, barely bothering to make his report seem the fruit of method. A lady in a heavy veil, thin, quick, went into the EC door and out again within a minute, carrying a flat parcel against her side. The constable who trailed her lost her at Fetter Lane when a dray blocked the way. He swears she turned down towards Hatton Garden. The jeweller's quarter, I said, where a woman of sense may purchase violet ink and musk without remark, Holmes added. His gaze moved once along the facades, taking from each its little confession. And you, Inspector. I went to the neighbours, as you said. The lithographer shares a wall. He heard a faint buzzing last night, like a wasp under a glass, and then a soft thump as of a lid shut. The marine lamp fellow says the tenants are new. 3 weeks, name of Carter. A gentleman and his wife, trade registered as electrical chronometry. He remembers the gentleman's hands, black at the nails and a scar on the left wrist. They took delivery of 2 heavy boxes labelled ebonite. Insulation for coils, Holmes murmured. Very proper. Come, we will try the humble road. He mounted the steps and tugged the bell with the casual authority of a man born to make inspectors of meters uncomfortable. The same cautious voice answered. The same chain checked our entrance, and the same sweet stale smell crept out. Gas inspection, Holmes announced with the bleak boredom of the official. He tapped the bell plate with his knuckle, made a note upon an imaginary slate, and continued, Complaint of intermittent ringing, sir, likely due to your lead return sharing the frame. Also, by order, we are to examine private batteries where they abut the house supply. If you prefer summons, I shall happily fetch a constable. A pause. The chain slid. 2 minutes, said the voice, and do not touch the instruments. We entered a narrow passage hung with the cheap lithographer's prints that can make a room look prosperous at a distance. The man who met us had the careful neatness common to poor professionals. Collar mended but starched, coat brushed to within a thread of its life, boots overshined to mislead. His eyes, which were a light, untrustworthy grey, settled on my friend and then most tellingly upon the gauntlets. He shifted his left wrist, revealing the pale scrap of a burn scar such as an incautious coil will bite. Holmes did not glance at it. His indifference is a blade that cuts without seeming to move. "The basement first," he said briskly. "Your bell wire couples to the gas pipe under the stair. We have had complaints of magnetization, and the board will not relish another suit." "Magnetization?" The man compressed his lips upon a speck of scorn. "Clocks, sir, and the men who keep them are more delicate than you imagine." Holmes's eyebrows flickered in faint apology. "I never imagine where I can measure. If you will have the kindness to open—" "Thank you." The cellar was a narrow burrow with a bench along one wall upon which stood, in orderly array, 2 cells of the Leclanché type, a small Ruhmkorff coil, and the skeleton of a regulator clock whose heart had been plucked out. The smell I had noted at Whitlock's wrote its signature here. On a peg hung a lady's veil. On the bench, close by the coil, lay a visiting card with its edges browned. Holmes's hand hovered above but did not alight. "Your wife assists you, Mr. Carter?" he asked abstractly, tracing with a finger the pattern left in dust by a box lately removed. "My sister," the man returned too quickly. "She keeps books and ink," Holmes said in the tone of one who grants domestic virtues their due. He bent to the bell return, touched the wire with a gloved knuckle, and said over his shoulder, "Watson, note the ring detuned by the presence of this shunt. Remove that wire, if you please." I stooped and obeyed. The bell upstairs, released of some secret check, gave a delicate ting that sounded absurdly like a guilty cough. "Better," Holmes said. "Now the bench. Your batteries are powerful for so light a need." "We perform restorations," the man replied. "Marine chronometers demand a severe current for certain tests." I saw Holmes's gaze quicken by the merest hair. "Of course. You have perhaps one under your care at present. We do not discuss clients." His tone sharpened. "If you have finished, sir—" "Almost." Holmes lifted a cloth from the bench with 2 careful fingers. Beneath lay a square of oiled silk, within which something had been cradled. The imprint showed its shape as plainly as a footprint. A round case with shoulder lugs and, stamped on the silk in faint oily ghost, the letters "Rukai" cut off by the fold. Lestrade, who had held his breath manfully until this moment, expelled it in a warlike snort. Holmes's eyes did not move from the silk. "A neat outfit," he said merely as one craftsman to another. "May I speak with your sister?" "She is not at home." "Then I shall call again." Holmes dropped the cloth. "In the meantime, the bell will behave." We were nearly to the street when Holmes checked, as if listening to a sound too fine for my ears. He turned his head a fraction to one side. From the back room there came a tiny click, and then another, like insects applauding. The air altered. The hairs along my wrist prickled. I smelled that sharp metallic tang. Holmes moved without haste, but with a certainty that seized the eye. He crossed the passage and pushed open the back room door. It was a workroom bright as a theatre, every surface cleared save for a single arrangement upon the centre table. A carriage clock with its back removed, a small coil wired cunningly to its escapement, a slate upon which someone had chalked 1:13, and, on a shelf above, 3 other clocks poised at differing minutes, their hands arrested at the instant when a hidden switch should feed them mischief. "Demonstration," Holmes said softly, "for a client, or a vanity mirror." The man had followed us and now stood in the door like a cat that calculates its gap. "Sir," he said, "you are exceeding—" He was cut by a peremptory rap at the street door, once, twice, thrice in Lestrade's pattern, followed by the unmistakable tread of the inspector himself. Carter's face altered. The careful mask cracked for the breadth of a pulse, and I saw beneath it the naked resource of a man cornered among his tricks. Holmes turned half a degree, as if to admire the sheen of brass upon the shelf. "It is as well," he murmured for me alone, "that I borrowed a page. Do you recall the prescription for patience?" I find I cannot take it. Now watch. When I lift this wire, time will forget to fail." He reached, poised, and with a surgeon's neatness pinched a lead from the coil. The room's tension broke like a thread. Somewhere in the house a bell, restored to honesty, rang clear as a conscience. And from the street Lestrade's voice, high with official indignation and relief together, cried, "Open in the Queen's name." Holmes's eyes, bright as a blade, flicked to the chalked 113, then to the man with the scarred wrist. "And so," he said, as we heard the chain slide and the bolt retreat, "we advance from preface to text." Lestrade entered with 2 constables, his hat clamped under his arm and triumph already half-formed upon his lips. The man with the scarred wrist, Carter, if that were his name, had retreated a pace from the table as if our presence radiated a heat he dared not cross. His eyes went at once to the shelf where the arrested clock stood, then to the chalked 113, and finally to Holmes's gloved hand, which remained with exasperating ease upon the disengaged lead. "You will oblige me," Holmes said gently, "by keeping your hands where they are. There is nothing so undignified as a man who outruns his own explanation." Lestrade swung the door wide, took in the bench, the coil, the slate, and gave a short, harsh laugh. "Well, well." Electrical jiggery and a clerk's smug face. "That will do. Name?" The man's mouth worked as if he were choosing which name would most readily pass. "Edmund Carter, E.C., murmured Holmes without looking up. A relief to find at least one honest label in the room. Carter's knuckles whitened. "You have no right—" "We have as much right," interrupted Lestrade, "as the Queen's warrant to inquire into the death of Mr. Josiah Whitlock, and more to the point, the theft of his property. Your sellers will tell me if that right alarms you." He nodded to the nearer constable. "Search." Holmes let the wire fall back into place with a delicate touch, as one returns a violin to its case. He had drifted meanwhile to a wall cupboard, whose key had been left injudiciously in its ward. A turn and a pull laid bare a narrow interior, fitted with pegs and shallow drawers. Within, a cotton-lined tray had been lately vacated. Its nap still bore the faint circle of a watch-case. Holmes cocked his head, and with his pencil lifted from the far corner, a small triangle of transparent mica, such as one finds protecting an engraved cover. Upon it, reversed and faint, I could read 3 letters that might as well have been a signature, H.I. "Whitlock's watch," I breathed, "or any Carter began. But the rest of the family of names died at Lestrade's glare. The constable from below called up that he had found, in the oiled cloth, nothing but the smell of oil and the impression of something round. The lady's veil, however, was in the peg-hole, and 2 small vials, one of violet ink, one of some essence whose sweetness carried even to my place, lay corked upon the shelf." Holmes's nostrils flared half a line. "Perfume," said he, "of the sort that clings." He touched the bottle to the light, a cheap musk cut with heliotrope. "It bespeaks taste rather than purse, and if I am not at fault, will leave a signature upon paper for those who know where to smell. Inspector, do not flatter yourself that your quarry spells only in ink." Carter had recovered his tongue. He attempted dignity and landed upon officiousness. "We restore delicate mechanisms for gentlemen. If a watch bearing those letters has been placed in our care, it is in the ledger, and the ledger is private." Holmes turned, and there was that in his face which tells a man whether there is still a path by which he might leave a room with honor. "Your ledger," he said, "will be in a lock drawer right of the bench, second down, the one with the splintered lip. You break your fingernail there of an evening, but have not yet fetched the file. Ah, thank you." Lestrade had already pounced and produced the book, a stout stationer's volume written in a hand whose fussiness concealed rather than revealed its intent. Holmes paged without haste. Columns of dates, initials, brief descriptions, R.C., fusee chain, relink. E. Carter, coil varnish, charged to shop. J.W., marine rate test. He paused, the page under his finger breathing out faint violets. "You see?" Carter cried, pouncing upon the last line as a drowning man will grasp a reed. "J.W., a marine chronometer, our business." Holmes's smile showed only the upper teeth. I see that you have written those 2 entries at different hours with the same ink. The violet has not yet oxidized here. There it has done so and darkened. Also that JW stands upon a little island of erasure. What name sat there yesterday? Carter said nothing. He had discovered that silence in some men is the only courtesy they can manage without practice. Before Lestrade could frame a threat, a cry from the street below cut through us. A newsboy, his bell shrilling as if the city itself must be wakened to the proclamation, trotted past the door bawling, "Robbery in Regent Street." Jeweler's safe opened. "Time lock fail at the hour. Extra!" Lestrade stared at the window, as if the pane itself had turned informer. Holmes's head gave the smallest of bows, an acknowledgment rather than a surprise. "Our second act," he murmured. The inspector darted to the stairhead. "You run down and fetch me that paper!" He snapped to the constable nearest the door. "And you to the other. Take this man to the kitchen and sit across from him with your hands upon his wrists. If he twitches, you will regret not having twitched faster." Carter allowed himself to be led, his mask settling back with sickly composure. He had the air of a conjurer caught in his first false shuffle, still hoping the rest of the pack might yet obey him. Holmes meanwhile wrote swiftly upon a scrap from the ledger's flyleaf and pressed it into my palm. "To Hartigan," he said in a low voice. "By the Fleet Street boy. He is to proceed with the note at once. We shall have our visitor at 3, even if this one is lost to us now. Tell him also to send back word who called upon the notice, if any." I made to go. Holmes detained me with a glance at the coil. "And Watson, if you smell ozone between here and the street, step on the rubber mat, and not upon the brass strip. Mr. Carter is as ingenious as a man who has read the last page of a primer and believes himself an author. I will not have you educating him further with your person." I obeyed, and was halfway down when the boy's extra was thrust into my hand by the constable. I scanned the bold print as I returned. The story was breathless and imprecise, as is the way of those papers which sell their haste by the inch, but the skeleton stood clear. At 1 o'clock, the assistant manager of Pargeter & Co., jewelers of Regent Street, had examined his safe, which boasted a time lock of American invention, set to reopen at 9 in the morning, and at no other. He had left it dogged. At 1:13, a subordinate returning for a misplaced key found the door ajar and the inner drawers rifled. No marks of violence upon the case, no sign of tool, no broken bolt. "The time lock," the report concluded, "is the very thing which must have failed." Holmes read the column with a kind of weary tenderness, such as one gives a child who has stumbled exactly where one feared he might. He looked from the line to the chalked 1:13 still fresh upon Carter's slate, and then to the arrested clocks above. "You perceive the arc," he said to me. "Mr. Whitlock dies beneath a comedy of failures at 13. The town is instructed by telegraph and by whisper that time is infirm. The journeymen of our craft are baited with talk of anomalies. Thank you, Hartigan. And while the brain is taught to doubt, the fingers go about their work unremarked. Fear for lock opens in Regent Street at 1:13. Why, it is only that Greenwich yawned." Lestrade, returning, crushed the paper in a hand that begged for wrists. "Then this rascal," he jerked his head kitchenwards, "and his lady with the veil, are instruments," Holmes said, "or perhaps artists in a provincial theatre who flatter themselves they have taken Drury Lane. No, Inspector. There is a mind here which loves symmetry. We shall know it presently by its gratification. Vanity, as I told Watson, keeps excellent time." He replaced the ledger in its drawer, but not before tearing from its spine with a surgeon's neatness a scrap of stiff paper which had been glued along the cloth. He rubbed it once between forefinger and thumb. A film lifted, and beneath, revealed in paler pulp, were penciled figures. 12:02. Fan 13. Fire the last broken off in the tier. "Appointments," I said. "Rehearsals," said Holmes. "The noon which was Whitlock's true last hour, the 13 which is the trick's flourish, and the 3 at which pride keeps an assignation." He slid the scrap into his notebook. Watson, your legs. Fleet Street and back, he nodded. Go. Lestrade, if you value your case, you will not yet clap irons upon Mr. Carter. Arrest conceals as much as it displays. Let him stew upon the possibility that he is still admired for his conjuring. Moreover, he crossed to the demonstration table once more, and with a deftness born of too much thought for any one pair of hands, reconnected the coil, set the carriage clock to the heady instant before 2, and chalked upon the slate beneath the insolent 113, the sober figure 3. Moreover, he finished, if a certain lady reads the blackboards of Hartigan and Sons and loves a triumph, she will come to watch the trick performed where she once performed it best. We shall be here to applaud. Unless she smells a trap, Lestrade objected. Holmes's eyes went to the veil upon the peg, the bottle of heliotrope musk, the faint violet breath in the ledger, and the scar-white crescent on a left wrist. She will come, he said quietly, because the case-time forgot is to her only a mirror. She cannot resist a second glance. He looked at the chalked hour as one consults a friend. And we, Watson, do not be late. Punctuality in Holmes was a courtesy he extended to machinery as well as men. I made my errand to Hartigan with such speed as the Strand's eddies allowed, found the proprietor already primed to play his part, and returned to Holborn before the hour had half run down. The blackboard at Hartigan's bore among its discreet notices the line my friend had dictated, and even as I waited for the Fleet Street boy to be dispatched with Holmes's second missive, a thin clerk with an ink-stain upon his cuff had paused to read, pursed his lips as if tasting the words, and gone out with a look of importance that suggested he knew precisely where to carry them. Holborn presented our little theatre unchanged. Lestrade had posted a man at the corner and another opposite. Carter, neither detained nor dismissed, sat at his kitchen table with his hands in sight, and a queer fixed courtesy arranged upon his face. Holmes had the workroom under his command, with the air of a surgeon attending to a patient, who must not be allowed to close his eyes. He had adjusted the carriage clock such that the minute hand trembled a hair's breadth from the hour. The coil sulked like a chastened snake. Upon the slate, the figures 3 Marple stood in a hand I knew to be the same which once jotted calculations of bullet flight. "You saw callers at Hartigan's?" he asked without raising his head. "One," I said. "A clerk who read and went as if summoned." "Good. Pride keeps its appointment." He stepped to the window and with 2 fingers put back the blind, no more than a whisper. The street lay grey and busy, its noises batting idly against our panes. A hansom slowed, considered, and moved on. A woman with a basket bought a paper. A boy skipped between wheels with the indifference of his kind to the physics that govern crushed limbs. Then, as neatly as a cue, a lady in a heavy veil slipped from the mouth of Fetter Lane and came along the pavement with the gait of one who owns her purposes but is not vain enough to show them. "She," Holmes said. "Lestrade." The inspector, who had been feigning an interest in Carter's ledger so exaggerated as to be a form of sarcasm, came at once. He had the sense to efface himself behind the door, and to let his face learn patience rather than triumph. Holmes, whose smallest persuasions were as intentional as any man's boldest acts, took a position not far from the table, where the demonstration had been laid, his gauntlets removed and tucked into his belt, his sleeves turned back to a height which made him look for an instant dangerously human. The knock that followed had a serenity which made the knuckles that caused it almost visible in the mind's eye, small, fine, and precise. Carter, at a nod from Lestrade, went to the door. I caught the lift of his chest before he reached it, and as the chain ran and the jam yielded, the faintest intake of breath which told me that hope, if that was his companion's name, had returned to him in her own person. She entered as perfume enters, first as a suggestion, then as a memory, and only at last as a body. The cheap musk softened by heliotrope came first, then the violet undertone of her ink, which is a thing I had not thought to smell until Holmes taught me the noses of papers, and then the woman herself, slender as a rapier, with a chin too wilful for prettiness and movements that betrayed a fine contempt of fools. Her veil muted her features to a pleasing enigma. She wore a dark gown cut with that exactness which tells a dressmaker's mind as much as a purse's depth, and upon her left glove a faint smear of black where some bottle had bitten. "Mr. Carter," she said, without turning her head to acknowledge the rest of us, "I am late." Holmes answered her as if he were the instrument to which all clocks must tune. "Merely exact, madam." She glanced then, a quick, fluent sweep that counted men as some women count chairs in a room before they sit. "Ah," she said lightly, "the board has sent another gas man. How they multiply." "Time does not multiply, madam," Holmes returned pleasantly. "It divides. We have arranged a small division for you." Carter, who had gone white and then a shade too red, recovered enough arrogance to present the table as if it were a stage and he the stage manager. "As discussed," he said to her, "they have complained of magnetization. I have shown them how a poorly insulated bell may affect delicate works." "Has he?" she asked of no one in particular, and her voice carried a dryness which suggested that Carter's instruction had more often been received than applauded. "Very well. Show me the hour." Holmes's hand hovered above the switch. The carriage clock's second hand hesitated, with that little drama which belongs to seconds when men watch them. "First," he said, "permit me to acquaint you with the audience." He indicated Lestrade with a tilt of his head. "Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who dislikes theatre when the tickets are paid for with other men's property. Dr. Watson, who prefers his hours to pass without unnecessary shocks. And myself, who entertains an unreasoning affection for honest clocks." If the name struck her, the veil refused the confession. Only the tilt of her head altered half a degree. "Our demonstrations are private. Your letters," Holmes said, "were not." He touched the pocket where the telegram lay. She did not start. She did not even stiffen. But I saw, beneath the veil's filigree, the brief tightening at the corner of the mouth, which is the body's smallest acknowledgment that it has been met and measured. "Words are cheap," she said. "Mechanism is dear. Proceed." Holmes nodded once, and with that same surgeon's economy with which he had earlier arrested the farce, lifted the connecting lead and set it lightly down. The coil gave a sulk. The air sharpened. Carter's eyes slid to the slate. 3 quarts. The room took on that peculiar hush which inhabits banks at the minute before the hour strikes, and theatres at the instant before the curtain rises. The second hand kissed 12. The minute touched the upright. Nothing failed. The wheel went on. The heart of the little clock beat through the change as evenly as a sleeping child's. Science, Holmes observed conversationally, is occasionally at home to those who call at the right moment. Carter's chair rasped. What have you? Disconnected the vanity and left the principle, Holmes returned. "Madam, you will observe that when the coil's return is not taken through the frame, the field fails to seize the balance. Your trick remains a trick. Time, lamentably for your purposes, resumes its habits." She moved closer as if smell alone could instruct her through the veil. "You have altered nothing," she said softly. "Save the hour." "Ah," Holmes breathed, with that little inward content I have heard from him upon certain evenings of music. "We are to speak plainly." "Very well. You and your colleague rehearsed your stoppages until 13 tasted sweet. You taught Hartigan's town to doubt. You courted the jewellers with whispers of anomalies. Then, with a companion elsewhere, you made use of that doubt when the Time Lock's guardians were at their laziest. A latch that fails at 13 becomes a story told by clerks to excuse a door they were bribed to leave dogged. All London loves a tale. You supplied one." Lestrade had edged to the kitchen door while she listened, and with a jerk of his chin brought up the constable with Carter in train. "Names," the inspector said, "and the location of the property." "I have a van outside that has never known disappointment." She laughed then, not shrilly, as women are said to do when nerves fail, but low and with a warmth that, had it been turned to mire instead of mischief, might have made a drawing-room grateful. "You will need a second van," she said. but you will not find it in Holborn." Carter, at that, betrayed himself with the smallest of motions, a glance toward the cupboard where the ledger had lain, and then to the shelf of clocks. Holmes followed the look lazily, as if clocks were the only vice in which he indulged. "I telegraphed from the Central Office," he said to her, "at 12 minutes past 1. You or one very like you. You used violet ink upon a veiling you later wore. You moved between Holborn and Hatton Garden with the confidence of a person for whom those streets are habit." He sniffed the air delicately. "Also, you have lately stood in a room where fine oils are used, sperm on which the better chronometers run, and a touch of colza. That room is not this one. Carter, your sister is more honest in her nostrils than in her ledgers." "Not my sister," Carter snapped, with a disdain that paid for years. "My employer." The veil turned to him with a slowness any man would do well to study. "You mistake our relation, Mr. Carter," she said. "I employ only time, and signatures," Holmes added. "Shall we put a name to E.C.? Edmund Carter is convenient, and yet a woman's hand seems to prefer it. Emma, Eugenia, Eliza, no matter. The city will supply the rest. Lestrade, if you desire a direction for your van, send one to the yard of Pargeter and Coes, where a porter named Malins keeps a private clock 5 minutes fast, so that his early departure is excused by the bell. He will have seen a man admit a lady at 12:55, and will swear, if pressed, that the safe opened itself at 13 past. Send a second cart to a pawn in 7 Dials, where marine chronometer oil can be smelled through the bricks. But keep yourself, if you please, for this house, for the lady has not yet admired herself in her own mirror." She had been so still that the perfume seemed to have settled into the room's pores. At the word mirror, she lifted a hand to her veil as a woman will to a hatpin. "You presume much," she said. "I presume only that you came to see whether your trick would survive an honest hour," Holmes returned. "It does not. Now here is my hour." He took from his pocket the singed card and laid it upon the bench, then the telegram, then, most gently, the triangle of mica on which the ghost of W.H.I. still showed. "Mr. Whitlock's watch left here in a parcel at noon and was delivered, where? To a hand that wrote J.W.'s Marine Rate Test and then tried to rub the man out. You have the watch, madam, or the knowledge of it. Give me that, and I shall speak well of your intelligence when stupid men wish to make it mere wickedness. Refuse, and I shall content myself with accuracy." Silence followed. It had the feel of a scale weighing a feather against a coin. Then she put up her hand once more, but not to unpin the veil. Instead, she loosened the glove and turned the slim wrist, so that across the tendons I saw the same crescent scar Carter wore, whiter than skin. "Accuracy," she murmured, "is only vanity's humbler cousin." She set her glove to rights, touched the slate where 3 down stood, and with a fingertip smudged the chalk, as if to prove that even figures could be made to blur if one had the will. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. If you can make time keep its virtue, you may also keep your bargain. The watch is not in Holborn. It is where a gentleman who once trusted Whitlock came to learn that the Admiralty's time could be bought by those who kept other kingdoms' clocks." "Names," said Lestrade, harsher than before. She inclined her head by a fraction. "When the van returns," she said. "To earn your second, you must first arrive with your first." She moved to the door, and though Lestrade put up a hand, Holmes stayed him with emotion. "Let her go," he said. "She comes to us by a circle. The point at which it closes is the thing I seek." She paused a heartbeat on the threshold. "And if circles do not close?" "They do," Holmes said with a gentleness I had seldom heard in him, save when he spoke of mathematics and music. When drawn by a steady hand, she went out. Carter made a noise of despair, which his pride strangled into a cough. Holmes laid his fingers a moment on the coil, feeling perhaps for heat as a man will feel a horse for sweat after a run. Then he looked at the slate, at the blurred 300, and smiled his thin, dangerous smile. "Now," he said quietly to Lestrade, "send for your van." Lestrade's van arrived in a clatter of hooves and a squeal of chain. While his men set about the unromantic business of lifting evidence from Carter's cellar and workroom, coil, batteries, ledger, the stained veil, and the vials, Holmes stood very still, his head a fraction bowed, as if listening to a pendulum that sounded only in his skull. When at last the boxes were trundled out, he roused, drew on his gauntlets once more, and looked from the blurred chalk on the slate to the street where the lady had vanished into the respectable river of Holborn traffic. "Now," he said, "we visit a place where time is supposed to be an alibi." Lestrade, who had been rehearsing a speech in which he would remind Holmes that Scotland Yard does not fetch and carry for private theatricals, thought better of it. "Pargeters first? If you love order," Holmes replied, "begin where men swear it to be sacred." Regent Street glittered even under a London sky. The brass plate of Pargeter & Co. had the sober confidence of old money. Inside, a hush fit to make a bank blush was broken only by the faint purr of velvet trays. A manager with a manner like cooled soup received us with the injured propriety of a man who has been sinned against in the columns of the press. "Our name," he began, "has been associated with a story," Holmes cut in pleasantly, "which a wiser man would be glad to see corrected. At 1 o'clock you examined your safe. At 1:13 your clerk found it ajar. Your time lock, an American contrivance of undeniable cleverness, is held innocent by you, guilty by the newsboy, and sacred by the inventor. Show me the lock." We were conducted below to a room that smelt faintly of new wood and old promises. The safe's face was a polished temple of steel. At its heart the time movement sat under glass like a pet idol. Holmes bent, his breath fogging the plate, and then, with a handkerchief between finger and brass, he lifted the little bell which, when the lock is set, rings the hour at which release is permitted. "Who wound this?" he asked. "Mr. Malins," the manager said, a certain stiffness entering upon the name, "our porter, who has that duty every evening." "Has he also the duty," Holmes said, "of correcting the clock which he keeps in his lodge 5 minutes fast?" The manager's mouth pursed. "I do not police private punctualities." "You shall today," Holmes returned. He examined not the lock at first, but its case. The screws were bright and too clean, the grooves burnished by a screwdriver that had entered them often and zealously. Upon the frame I saw, where his fingernail pointed, a smear of something pale. He touched it, rolled it, smelt it. "Beeswax," he murmured, to ease a bolt's pride. "And," he leaned to the jamb, "chalk, laid lightly and kissed away by a door closed without full engagement. Inspector, your van will not be required to carry off any magician. Your man with the fast clock received a sovereign to leave this door dogged, a sovereign to forget to check, and a newspaper tale to excuse the sin. We will ask him if I insult his honesty." Mr. Malins proved a square, anxious fellow with red hands and a lower lip that had learned the habit of telling on the upper. He came to heel in the manager's room, and if guilt has a smell it is of old beer and frightened sweat. He denied, he blustered. Then he wept, a short, angrier weeping that resented being forced to confess the obvious. Yes, he had been given £1 by a gentleman, with a smooth voice and a scar on the wrist, same as if the devil had pinched him. Yes, the gentleman's lady had come at 5 minutes to 1 for to look at pearl drops, and yes, against his habit he had let the door below sit on the catch, only till my smoke was done. He had thought no harm. The fast clock. Why, to keep me wife from saying I am late. Holmes listened with the tender attention he reserves for a mechanism once he has found its fault. "There, Inspector," he said softly. "You see how tales do the work of skeleton keys. The time lock never failed. Men did. Lestrade's jaw, which could express more rue than many men's voices, set. I'll have the man," he said. "You shall," Holmes agreed, "and the sovereign that bought him, if we are in time to pluck it back from the tavern. But do not trump it. The tale is more valuable to us unspoiled. Madame with the veil will rely upon it for her second act." He asked as casually as a gentleman might inquire the weather, whether any unusual callers had come since the occurrence. The manager hesitated, then produced a card left an hour past. It bore in copper plate E.C. and Comer's electrical chronometry, with the Holborn address we knew. "They offered to inspect the time lock gratis in the interest of the trade," he said, disdain curdling his tone. Holmes's eyes warmed a fraction. "Pride runs on schedule," he breathed, and returned the card. From Regent Street he took us by a string of turns to Seven Dials, where the streets knot themselves like thread at the bottom of a housemaid's work-basket. The pawn he sought had seen more tears than a chapel, and told fewer truths than a theatre. A man with a cat's moustaches and the eyes of a patient ferret looked up from his narrow kingdom as we entered. "We admire chronometers," Holmes announced, letting a whisper of sailor into his voice as he surveyed the rows of bottomed-out lives. Violins, boots, a perambulator with one wheel patient and 3 rebellious, particularly those that smell of the sea. The pawnbroker's face did not move. "We admire cash." Holmes laid a sovereign upon the worn wood. Then, as if idly, he brought out the triangle of mica on which W.H.I.'s ghost lay faint. "We also admire a man who keeps the covers of things he buys." It was not the coin that changed him, but the little transparency, which he took between finger and thumb as if it might etch his skin with guilt. "Never seen it," he said. Then, almost at once, "Who told you?" "Your nose," Holmes said. "There is sperm oil in this room, and colza that has been allowed to turn a day too long. Whitlock's breed. And," he inhaled, "heliotrope musk that has kissed a paper, and from the paper your ledger. Let us not waste the inspector's time with lies." A round parcel in oiled silk, left before noon. The initials on the back of the case, J.W. the customer. A lady with a veil who spoke in a voice that made men think themselves agreeable. The cat's moustaches twitched. "You ain't from Inland Revenue," he muttered, grudgingly yields the first of the reefed sails. "She left a watch to be valued. I told her I'd need the number. She said she'd send it. Your ticket," Holmes said. And the name she gave. The pawnbroker, after the calculation all men make when they balance the present against an imagined future, lifted a leaf of his ledger. Holmes leaned. A breath of violet rose up like a confession. The name, written small and neat, was Mrs. Effie Carew. "Another E.C., I said. "A mirror," Holmes replied. He slid the ticket back with 2 fingers. "If she returns with the number, do not be here. Go to your brother's for tea. The man at the next counter will serve her, and while he writes he will remark that the gentleman who loves elegant watches keeps a warehouse by the river where private work may be done, Deptford Way. He will say it in such a manner that the lady thinks herself very clever to have wormed it out of him. Do you understand me?" The ferret eyes gleamed. "Aye, I can be stupid for a shilling." "You shall be brilliant for 2, Holmes said, laying the second coin upon the first. "And if you are steady, a 3rd tomorrow." We left the Dials with its fog of misery and returned to Hartigan's, where the master of the place, with his immaculate cuffs and careful beard, met us with a subdued excitement. 2 callers to the notice, he reported. A boy from a watchmaker in Bloomsbury, who said his master's regulator had gained a second at 1:13 3 nights running. He carried a note written in violet. Holmes's nostrils approved the detail, and a gentleman with a left-hand scar who offered to lecture upon the phenomenon this evening to such mechanicians as cared to attend. At what hour? Holmes asked. 8. Where? In a back room of the Meridian public house off Fetter Lane. Holmes's eyes, which had been knives all afternoon, became a carpenter's rule. There is our 3rd mark, he said to me softly, the broken penciling in Carter's spineboard 3 completed. At noon, a death dressed as 13. At 13, a theft dressed as Providence. At 8, pride dressed as a lecture. He turned to Lestrade. You will go with 5 men to the Meridian at 7:30, and order ale with the patience of angels. Do not seize the gentleman at the door. Let him untie his own mask. Meanwhile we go to the river. The river? Lestrade echoed. Deptford, Holmes said. Where men keep clocks that must tell the truth in a swell and a fog. Our Lady's hint was meant to intoxicate. We shall drink it with a sober tongue. There is a warehouse near the victualling yard where an enterprising thief might promise secret corrections to owners impatient with Admiralty rules. He will find custom there among yachtsmen and foreign skippers. He will also find that chloroformed honesty smells much like colza oil left to turn. We took a cab south, the city opening around us like a map. Holmes had drawn and folded and now unfolded to show the path our feet must follow. In Deptford the air had the taste of old rope and river flat. Warehouses stood with their eyelids half shut. Holmes led us past the yard's wall, turned into a lane where a broken anchor rusted among nettles, and stopped before a brick building, whose shutters pretended to be sleep while the chink beneath them confessed wakefulness. A sign, discreet to the point of secrecy, read, "Marine Adjustments Private." Holmes put his ear to the seam, then stepped back and smelt the crack. The smile that dawned upon his face had no warmth in it at all. "Sperm and colza," he said. "And a clock that thinks itself wiser than Greenwich," he rapped. A bolt drew. The man peered, a different face than Carter's, heavier with that disenchanted cunning one finds in those who have been respectable and are tired of it. Holmes's manner melted into the easy cheer of a gentleman yachtsman whose money has not yet learned caution. "I am told," he said, "that a fellow may have his chronometer taught new tricks here without the Admiralty." Peering over his shoulder, the man's eyes measured us and found Lestrade, unconvincing as a yachtsman, but perhaps profitable as a fool. "Depends who tells you," he said. "A lady," Holmes returned, "with a veil and a scar for a footman. She's fond of 13, the brows twitched. The door opened another inch. "You'd best come in," the man said, with the roux of one who knows the circle is narrower than he would like, and closing faster than he had planned. Holmes went in as into a friend's library, his hands relaxed at his sides, his head slightly bent, not in humility but to hear the room. On the bench a brass bowl lay open, its escapement breathing the measured patience of a true chronometer. Beside it stood a carriage clock, whose back had been removed and then replaced with a care that left one screw misaligned. Upon a shelf were bottles, sperm oil, colza, lemon to sweeten, a cheap musk to lie to ladies' noses. And in a drawer which Holmes opened as if the owner had asked him to admire its order, lay an oiled silk with a round ghost, faint as the impression left by a pressed coin. At its edge, as if a single letter had refused to leave, the ghost of a serif lingered. Holmes drew in the perfumes of guilt, as a gourmand will examine a sauce with his breath before he stains his tongue. "Lestrade," he said almost gently, "you will keep this door. No one goes out save a message I will put into your hand. Watson, examine the far shelf. You will find there a bottle of violet ink which has been thinned with bad water. The sediment will show under the glass. Our Lady writes economy in every flourish." He turned to the man who had admitted us. "Your name is Hargreaves," he said, "and you left the Navy with a pension that disappointed you. The lady offered you business that flattered you. She will offer you abandonment when you cease to be amusing. In the meantime, you will tell me where Josiah Whitlock's watch lies." Hargreaves's mouth set in the miserable resolution of a man who has decided to lie long before he has chosen which lie. "Never heard of him." Holmes's hand moved to the chronometer bowl and set it spinning lightly. "When a bowl turns," he observed, "the gimbals tell the truth. When a man turns, his eyes do. Yours went to the loft shelf where cheap watches live, while the good work is done. Bring down the fourth from the left. If you must lie, bring down the third." Hargreaves hesitated. Then he reached, his hand moving to the fourth. He laid a watch upon the bench, thick, homely, honest, with the sort of case a man wears all his life and oils himself on Sundays. Holmes touched the back with his fingernail. The click was the exact note of Whitlock's room. He opened it. Upon the inner cover a paper disc lay, the sort of tally watchmakers use. Blank save for one penciled figure, clean and neat, 12:02. Holmes let out a breath that I had not known he held. He slipped the disc under the glass as tenderly as if it were a wafer. "There," he said. "Time remembers. And now we may teach forgetfulness to those who would sell it. From the street, faint and far, there came the three-quarter chime of a church that held Greenwich as a friend. Holmes looked at his own watch, then at Lestrade. "We have an hour and a half," he said. "Long enough to make the Meridian's audience learn humility, and Our Lady to believe herself adored." He turned the paper disc between his fingers like a coin he has no intention of spending. "Come, Watson. We go to write a little lecture of our own." The Meridian was one of those respectable public houses which, by the mere disposition of their partitions and the discreetness of their blinds, contrive to shelter business from beverage. The landlord, a broad man whose quiet eyes had seen more private parliaments than Westminster, nodded us toward a back room varnished to a gloss and smelling faintly of stale hops and chalk. Holmes let his glance slide across the benches, the peg rail, the small stove with its red mouth, and in 2 breaths knew how the audience would arrange itself when pride took the chair. "We shall not appear as Scotland Yard," he murmured, smoothing his cuffs. "We shall appear as ears." He adjusted my cravat with a fastidious pinch. "If anyone asks, you are Mr. Watson of the Bloomsbury practice, whose regulator gained a second at 1:13 3 nights running. You will be rapt, puzzled, slow to assent." He drew from his pocket a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles and set them upon his nose. The effect was extraordinary. The keenness of his gaze did not alter, yet it seemed to withdraw behind glass, as if observing through an instrument and declining responsibility for what it saw. I'm a mechanician who distrusts electricity. Lestrade, with his men filtering in by ones and twos, chose places that looked like happenstance. The door to the alley stood upon a hook. A second exit, I observed, gave upon a short passage to the tap-room. The landlord had set out a slate and a lump of chalk upon the trestle table that served as a rostrum. Above the stove, the clock's brass face reflected a fire that owed the evening no explanation. They straggled in by driblets, the small tribe of those who love wheels. Clerks with wire-stained cuffs, a watchmaker with magnifier still screwed into the eyebrow, a boy eager past his own sense, 2 men whose boots said river, though their speech would later call it sea. Hartigan himself arrived with a sober bow that placed him among the curious rather than the outraged. I caught the sweet sour breath of paraffin at my left. At my right, a gentleman of the old school cleared his throat as if to remind, asked that he had paid for many hours and preferred not to have his definition of time altered, without his consent. At the stroke of 8, the door from the passage opened, and the gentleman with the scarred wrist entered as if the room had risen politely. He had combed himself with care. The mended collar shone. The scar made a pallor bracelet below the cuff. Behind him came the lady in the veil. She paused where the stove's glow could not betray her profile, and for an instant I thought she meant to retreat. Then she chose a chair from which she might see the slate's chalk and every face at once. If she noticed Holmes's spectacles, they earned no more of her favor than any other pair in the room. "Gentlemen," said the scarred man, touching the brim of his hat with an attempt at humility that looked better upon other men, "I am asked to say a word upon a phenomenon that has troubled our calling. Certain clocks," he inclined his head toward the stove's red pupil as if its heat were a witness, "have of late exhibited a retardation at the 13th minute after the hour. The cause I shall demonstrate lies not in Greenwich, which we must reverence, but in a subtlety of currents," here his hand caressed an imaginary wire, "passing inadvertent through frames and returns. A simple remedy." He took up the chalk and sketched upon the slate a crude scheme of coil and escapement, bell and board. The boy gasped. The old gentleman's cough sharpened. Hartigan's eyes became flint. As the lecturer spoke his patter, creditable, practiced, half true, and therefore twice dangerous, I saw the veil tilt the merest fraction. She was not listening to be taught. She was listening to be admired. Holmes waited until the man had reached that moment wherein an audience settles to conviction. He raised a hand as a modest tradesman might, palm not quite flat. "Sir," he said, with the dry politeness of one who purchases his own doubts, "you speak of fields where no magnet is declared. Will you show the thing walk and not merely draw its footprints?" A murmur went through the benches. The lecturer, who had expected that request, produced from a valise a carriage clock, whose back had suffered many hands, and an induction coil like the serpent we had tamed in Holborn. He made a little theatre of connecting the leads, of placing the clock upon the trestle, of tapping the glass with one fingernail to show how time treads before it is tripped. Then, with a flourish that confessed his love of the part, he touched the switch. The air changed. The second hand hesitated, then died at the 12, the minute hand trembling at 13 past. "There," he said softly, almost tenderly. "Observe." "Observe," Holmes returned in the same tone. He rose with a clumsiness that would not have rung true on any other man, and came forward. "And forgive an old prejudice. Might a foolish mechanic try the connection?" He did not wait for consent. With a dexterous blunder, he shifted the return from frame to free, lifted a lead by the barest hair, and smiled an apology. "My fingers are clumsy." "Pray go on," the lecturer obliged. He touched the switch again. Nothing failed. The second hand went on with infuriating equanimity. A rustle like dry leaves ran along the benches. The boy breathed out a thin "oh," as if something he had loved had proved mortal after all. The scarred man recovered with an admirable lie. "So you see, different frames exhibit the same innocence," Holmes said, removing the spectacles with which he had defended his eyes from our folly. His face resumed its true shape. The glass had been a gate. Behind it stood the man. "Enough. My name is Sherlock Holmes. The phenomenon at 113 exists only in the vanity that would sell forgetfulness to men who rely upon remembering. You," he turned to the gentleman of the old school, "may keep your hours. Use," to the boy, "may love your wheels without shame. And you, madam, may have the credit that is your due." She did not stir. Only the faintest pressure upon the glove's fingers betrayed a hand that had clenched and now reconsidered. Lestrade had not moved either. He had folded his hands as if in a pew, and looked at the lecturer with a gravity that would have befitted a parson. The room, wanting a leader for its indignation and afraid to appoint one, let Holmes have the chair without the landlord's leave. "You had two motives," Holmes went on, addressing the veil across the hubbub that tried and failed to rise. "The first, to enrich yourself by stealing under the cloak of a tale that would explain any open door. The second, to punish a man. Mr. Whitlock taught ships to keep the world's time. He would not sell that craft to those who wished to make private hours. You sent him a telegram at 1:12 that his death would make a jest. You dressed his room to say so. You put his watch," he touched his breast lightly, "into the stream by which dirty things are carried while clean men avert their eyes. At the word, 'watch,' Hargreaves, the Deptford man who had slipped in by the alley door in a cap not quite low enough, made a betrayed sound and caught himself." Lestrade's head turned by a degree. The scarred lecturer's eyes went to the lady in a motion he could not prevent. It was as involuntary as a needle's obedience to a field. "You may say," Holmes continued, softer now and therefore more heard, "that I cannot prove the telegram was yours, that violet ink is a cheap vanity, that musk is a common economy, that 13 is a liar's lucky number. I will not argue. I will only ask the gentleman with the scar to show us his left wrist. Now look here," he began hotly and stopped, for the glove's edge had ridden up the breadth of a hair, and the white crescent bit him like cold. "And I will ask," Holmes said, with the gentleness he reserves for ending, "whether Mrs. Effie Carew would care to correct the name in the pawnbroker's ledger before the Inland Revenue does. It is a small matter, madam. I would not have you answer to smaller men for so shabby a lie." The veil did not lift. It bowed once. When she spoke, it was to the room. "Gentlemen," she said, and the room, which had expected protest, quieted as men do for weather they have misread. "If your clocks are to be safe, you must not teach them to lie for you. Mr. Whitlock would not lie. For that I disliked him. For that, the pause was as light as the prick of a pin, I also admired him. Mr. Holmes, if you have his watch, you have time's pity. Use it. Lestrade unfolded from the pew, and the yard came with him, as 3 plain men can be an army when a room has changed its mind. The lecturer moved, as if he meant to push aside fate and pass, but 2 hands were upon him before his thought had found his feet. The veil stood. She made no attempt to flee by the alley. Pride had set her here. Pride kept her until it had taken its full measure of gaze. Not here, Holmes said quickly, as Lestrade's fingers twitched toward the kerchief in his pocket. You will not tear theatre into farce. The lady will walk to the cab. Mr. Hargreaves will go with P.C. Simpson to the warehouse, where he keeps the instruments of his persuasion. Mr. Carter. You will not find Mr. Carter. He departed at the half-hour by the side door. Let him run 5 streets. There is a kind of mercy in showing a man he cannot outrun himself. Lestrade grunted what might have been agreement. It might also have been despair at losing a fish to catch the net. He signalled his men with a lift of the chin. The room, having been told where virtue lived and where folly, relaxed its anger into a murmur that was part satisfaction and part the mild sorrow men feel when a conjurer's apparatus is carried. Out under daylight, Holmes stood back and permitted the traffic of justice to flow. As the lady passed him, close enough for the heliotrope to touch even my duller nose, he said very low, "At 12:02, madam." She paused the tick of a second. "At 12:02, she repeated. "Then he died at his own hour. It will comfort no one, but it is true." "It will comfort me," Holmes said. When they had gone and the benches emptied in that hurried politeness by which London escapes embarrassment, Hartigan came to us with both hands extended. "Sir," he said, "I have loved clocks all my life and thought them innocent. Tonight they have seemed brave." "Bravery," Holmes replied, replacing the spectacles in his pocket, "is only the habit of keeping one's hour when cowardice offers another. You will do me a kindness. You will take this." He passed him the paper disc from Whitlock's watch. "And copy upon your blackboard tomorrow." At 12:02, Mr. Whitlock's watch ceased. The observatory kept the second. "Both tell the truth." Hartigan swallowed. "It shall be done." Holmes took up his hat. The stove's red mouth had lowered to a contented glow. Above it the clock, ignorant of scandal, counted our breaths. "Come, Watson," he said. "We will walk to Baker Street. There is a draught in the night that tastes of the river, and I require it. Tomorrow we shall give back a watch and take a statement. Tonight I will permit myself a luxury." "What luxury?" He smiled sidelong. "To imagine the precise expression with which Inspector Lestrade is at this moment being thanked by his superiors for having apprehended the phenomenon of 113. Morning found Baker Street genial with coal and fog, and Holmes at his violin, not for music but for tone, testing each string as if seeking a pitch that answered to 12.02. Mrs. Hudson's excellent kidneys had gone cold on my plate before he lowered the bow. "You will forgive me," he said, setting the fiddle by with an apology to which only Wood was entitled. "Time has been abominably lectured, and I am minded to hear it speak for itself. We have 3 loose threads, Watson. The telegram's hand, the motive that made a jest of a death, and the circle Our Lady hinted, the buyers of private hours." Before I could answer, the Fleet Street boy who had run for us twice already appeared with a red face, and a salute performed by dropping his cap. "From Mr. Hartigan, sir, and from the superintendent of the Central, and a note what come up sneakin', left at your door." Holmes took the packet. Hartigan's hand announced that his blackboard bore as directed. At 12:02 Mr. Whitlock's watch ceased. The observatory kept the second. "Both tell the truth. 2 men," he added. "Kelm came to scoff and stayed to read. 1 smelt of paraffin. The superintendent's return was neat and official. Yes, the lady in the heavy veil who lodged the first telegram at 1:12 had given as her name Mrs. Carew. The clerk remembered the violet. He also remembered a scent he could not name. The second wire, sent at 12:16 next day, had been written out in a gentleman's clerkly fist, and paid by a sovereign that had been nicked at the rim, as if a man had once tested it with nervous teeth. Holmes touched the third paper last. It was a single line in a precise feminine hand, folded twice. Time is bought in chambers as well as shops. Ask at Essex Court, E.C. Essex Court, I repeated. In the Temple. Where gentlemen who call themselves clubs pretend to be laws, Holmes returned. E.C. The letters multiply like rabbits when a woman has a mind to pasture them. Very good. He slid the note into his pocketbook beside the singed card. You will come to the yard. Lestrade was in a condition seldom seen in him, tidy elation tamped by practical annoyance. Hargreaves had yielded the Deptford premises. The stolen stones from Pargeters were found not there but under the false bottom of a sailor's chest, at a lodging-house 3 streets off. Carter had run. There was already a whisper he had taken the evening boat for Gravesend. The scarred lecturer, whose name proved to be Edmund Crane, again those obliging letters, sat glum and silent. As for the lady, she had given her name as Effie Carew and declined to answer questions, with a composure that scratched at Lestrade's temper like a pin in a cuff. You may scratch elsewhere, Holmes advised, and I marvelled again at the way my friend's voice could sharpen without rising. Mrs. Carew will tell us nothing for the pleasure of hearing you repeat it. Permit me 5 minutes. Lestrade, who had learned that 5 minutes of Holmes are cheaper than 5 hours of Scotland Yard, led us down. The matron admitted us to a narrow room where the heliotrope had been washed to the ghost of a memory. The veil had gone. The face beneath was what I had half expected, handsome in a fashion that values line above colour, with a mouth made for the utterance of verdicts rather than prayers. Mr. Holmes, she said at once, and I took it that she had spent the night rehearsing the tone. You sent me word, he returned. Essex Court. If a man would sell ours, she said, he needs a buyer who can insist that the bill is not seen. Solicitors' chambers are very good for that. There is a room there, taken in the name of the Essex Circle. Men who race yachts and lose fortunes go to hear how their clocks may be taught to win for them. Men who ride foreign mails prefer to start 5 minutes before anyone else. They pay to misread the world. Mr. Whitlock declined them. He told them that the sea has its own truth, and that men die when you ask it to lie. They do not forgive being called murderers by a gentleman who smells of oil. And you? Holmes asked. She held his gaze with an honesty that might have been a kind of pride. I despised him for being right. I admired him for being brave. A woman in my position is permitted only half of each. What position is that? A widow, she said simply, of a captain whose owner insisted he make Dover at a tide the chronometer did not love. He chose the owner's hour. The Goodwin Sands chose him. If you are seeking morality, Mr. Holmes, I suggest the Admiralty. They know where it is kept and at what price. It was not bitterness. It was a ledger read without comment. Holmes's face altered by the breadth of a line. He does not collect tragedies. He folds them and puts them where other men keep cigars. You will give me the names the Essex Circle uses to pay for its room, he said. I will give you the clerk who takes the money, she returned. He is fond of veils. He will tell you that a gentleman meets a gentleman at 4 of the clock today, and that the gentleman is not a gentleman but a foreign buyer who thinks English hours are slow, and English jewellery too, dear. Where did you spend 12:02? Holmes asked, like a man who asks whether a clock has been in the sun. In Red Lion Square, she said after a second that admitted the question and refused to be bought by it. Standing in the mews while Mr. Crane practised a story, he required that I time him. I had a better clock of my own. I heard the city strike. I thought of Mr. Whitlock's hands upon his cup. I did not go in. If you wish to call me a murderer for that, you may. It will be the first time I have been punished for not lying. Holmes stood. No, he said, and the word carried no praise and no pity. You have punished yourself. It saves Lestrade the trouble, We left her to the law. On the stairs, Holmes paused only to say to the inspector, "Essex Court, a room called the Essex Circle. 4 o'clock. Bring warrants written with a pen that does not blot. And have the superintendent at the Central hold any wire to Mrs. Whitlock's direction, if such exists. No, Watson, it is not in the file. It is in his caution. A woman who loves time enough to hate it will put her affairs in order by way of the post." "Whitlock had no wife," I objected, and was answered at once by my own memory. The quiet house, the maid, the immaculate long case, no feminine hand there. "His widow is not a woman," Holmes said dryly. "It is the Admiralty. We will see her now." At Whitlock's house in Red Lion Square, the constable at the door saluted Holmes, as a man salutes the clock he has learned to trust. Within, the hush had deepened into that particular quiet, which follows a man who insisted on principles. Holmes moved as he had done before, with that economy which wastes no glance. He went first to the almanac. Between the tides and eclipses, I saw now what I had missed. 3 pinholes along the margin, pricking nothing, save that when I laid the paper disc we had taken from the watch against the page, the penciled 12.02 sat between them like a bead on a string. "He marked his own last hour in his book," I said. "He marked a habit," Holmes corrected. He was teaching a class no one knew he held. Observe. He bent to the long case. The half-moon in the dust upon the weight, so eloquent of rehearsal, had been joined by a finer crescent near the pendulum's rating nut. He turned the nut, the gentlest of touches. A thread of grit showed black on his finger. Ground corundum again. Crane dressed the pallets until they behaved at 13. Our old man, exact even in protest, pricked his almanac to say, "This is the lie," and tucked a disc in his watch to say, "This is the truth." Holmes examined the baseboard behind the case and drew out, with the tongs, a narrow envelope addressed in that fine, clerkly hand which had written the second wire. It contained a billhead, Essex Circle, Essex Court Chambers, under which 2 names sat with the smugness of men who do not suppose their money has a cent. One was a yacht owner out of Cowes, the other a shipping agent who had once lost a contract to a foreign line. Between the 2 signatures a blot made a small black moon. "Your warrants will have work," Holmes remarked when we returned to the yard. "Your pawnbroker will earn his 3rd coin if he stands stupid this afternoon, and I shall pay a visit to the Temple. Essex Court is a little cul-de-sac, where the law attends to its conscience by distance. The room taken by the Circle was neat as a bill, and about as charitable. The clerk, a young man with a tie as careful as his ethics were not, tried to be clever and found that irony is a poor umbrella. He remembered Mrs. Carew's veil. He remembered the scar on Mr. Crane's wrist. He remembered that today at 4, a gentleman who called himself Émile Courvoisier, there were the letters again, made into a jest of nationality, would bring ready money to discuss adjustments. Holmes read the register and, with that peculiar satisfaction he only allows himself when a symbol ceases to be a riddle, tapped the initials at the head, E.C. Essex Circle. Edmund Crane, Effie Carew, Émile Courvoisier, electrical chronometry. Vanity writes monograms on everything it touches, he said, and wrote with the clerk's own pen upon the blotter, "At 4, the hour is honest." He left the phrase there as a man leaves a snare in a hedge. We spent the interval in a modest chamber below, to which the landlord of the Meridian, who had already declared himself on the side of hours that keep themselves, sent a plate of bread and cheese and a pot, whose honest bitterness made even Lestrade amiable. Holmes ate little and spoke less, but I saw his eye travel now and again to the square of sky beyond the casement, where a blade of sun tested itself against the fog and found itself equal. At 10 minutes to the hour he put on his gloves and smiled in that sideways fashion, which means the play is about to move into its last act. "Here," he said, handing me Whitlock's watch, which he had wound and set and polished until it looked as if habit had never left it, "is the only sovereign that does not lose value when you spend it. When our gentleman arrives you will let him see it. He will recognize the disc within and blush inwardly. Outwardly, he will quote a price. When he does so, Lestrade will discover that he has mislaid his patience. And you? I asked. I will ask the time, said Sherlock Holmes, of a liar. The hour approached with a precision that could only belong to a city accustomed to schedules enforced by steam, tide, and bell. Holmes had positioned us, Watson and Lestrade, in a chamber that gave us line of sight to the Essex Circle's appointed room. Outside, the temple's grey stones held the faint chill of late afternoon, the shadows growing along the court, as if measured by an invisible hand. I noted with admiration Holmes's patience. For once he did not pace nor drum. He seemed almost to breathe with the rhythm of the clocks themselves. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "the arrival of our gentleman. Note the direction of approach, the angle of his glance, the hesitation of his hand upon the latch. Every action a word, every pause a sentence. At 20 minutes past 4, a cab deposited a man of foreign cut and deliberate carriage. He had the air of one who has been well taught to observe London without learning it. His eyes, a faintly greenish-grey, swept the street and paused at the top of the court, where the clerk, nervous, careful, and properly attentive, stood as if suspended upon his pedestal. The man entered, his hat low but not concealing, and presented the sovereign that Hartington had foreseen would exchange hands. Holmes did not move. His glance, however, flicked from the coin to the cab, then to the room where Whitlock's watch rested upon the cloth like a patient in a cot. He tilted his head at Lestrade. Notice the pause at the threshold. He is measuring the virtue of honesty before seeking a convenience. The foreigner handed over the coin. The clerk bowed and made notes. "A purchase of adjustments," he said, and yet his voice faltered as if he had read too many signs at once. Holmes allowed him to proceed, silently noting the weight of the sovereign, the pressure upon the paper, the tilt of his wrist, and now he said softly, "Observe the lady." Effie Carew, whose veil had returned, entered with her accustomed discretion. She did not speak. She did not hesitate. She merely watched. Holmes's eyes, keen as any cat's, registered the minute twitch of her hand as it lifted toward her glove, the quick glance along the shelves, the tiny dip of her head at the sight of the coin. Pride and curiosity, two reliable forces, had drawn her here as surely as the tide pulls upon a buoy. The clerk produced the oiled silk wrapping. The foreigner, who was no fool, glanced at it with that mixture of hope and caution peculiar to a man who suspects a trap, but is compelled to test it. Holmes's fingers hovered, not yet moving, as if they themselves were instruments of observation rather than action. He watched the subtle hesitation, the calculation of risk, the almost imperceptible measuring of angles in the gentleman's gaze. Every motion, every micro-expression was recorded in the theatre of his mind. "Do you perceive, Watson," he said, "how men act when they believe they are unobserved? There is a microcosm here. The clerk, the foreigner, the lady, all writing letters upon the stage of conduct. If we read them aright, the plot will unfold without a single raised voice." The gentleman lifted the watch. He turned it over, examined the back, and his eyes widened imperceptibly at the sight of the paper disc tucked inside. Holmes allowed a small nod. "Recognition," he murmured. "The first true recognition. Observe the slight blanching of the lip, the tightening of the jaw. He knows that time has been held to its virtue, and that he has been found wanting." Effie Carew moved closer. Her veil barely stirred. She did not reach for the watch. She did not speak. She merely leaned forward, letting her presence become an unspoken inquiry. Holmes's gaze softened an infinitesimal degree. "Vanity," he said quietly, "has a measure of patience, but it cannot resist the truth when it comes elegantly dressed." The foreigner, Émile Courvoisier, as the clerk had whispered under his breath, handed the coin to Hartington and received a receipt, written carefully with violet ink, that carried the faint trace of musk. Holmes's finger traced the line from the receipt to the disc. from the disc to the gentleman's eye, and then, like a conductor signaling the final cadence, he spoke. "You have done well," Holmes said. "Your adjustments are honest, your coin is properly given, and your measure of discretion has been adequate. Yet the hour at which Whitlock's watch ceased remains true, and time, as you see, does not lie." Courvoisier's hand trembled slightly. "I understood only the need for precision," he said. His accent caught between caution and admiration. "And you, Madam," Holmes continued, turning to Carew, "have witnessed that even a clever jest cannot alter reality. The chronometer, like its maker, observes no whim, responds to no vanity, yields to no falsehood." Effie Carew inclined her head, a subtle concession. "Then you have proved what I suspected," she said. "That time is beyond us, and men less so." Holmes smiled faintly. "Time is merciful if one respects it. Mr. Whitlock's watch has returned to its proper course, and those who sought to bend it to amusement or profit have discovered the error of their calculations. Nothing more remains but to record the lesson." Lestrade, who had been standing stiffly, now allowed a faint smile. "I suppose the watch goes back to Red Lion Square?" he asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "It will, Inspector. There is no need for a constable to accompany the truth. Let it return to its master's honor. And the actors in this drama," he gestured at Courvoisier and Carew, "have played their parts. The final act is written, and the audience may retire with satisfaction. As we departed, Watson, I noted the quiet elegance with which Holmes folded the instruments of observation into his pocketbook. The small disc, the violet ink, the receipts. Every detail, every gesture had been accounted for. Outside, the Temple was bathed in that soft light that heralds evening, and the fog of London had lifted just enough for the river to glint faintly in the distance. Holmes walked with the serene step of a man who has tamed chaos, yet his mind, I was sure, was already threading together the final strands of the tale that London would remember as the case of 113, a story of vanity, precision, and the inexorable truth of time. Baker Street, that evening, welcomed us with the quiet warmth of familiar coal and oil lamps, yet the city outside continued its restless pulse as if nothing extraordinary had transpired. Holmes hung the coat he had worn for the expedition, and after a moment's pause by the mantel, turned to me with that peculiar intensity which signals a performance not yet complete. "Watson," he said, "the stage is set. We have observed the actors, recorded the instruments, and traced the lines of vanity through every hand and ledger. It remains for us to attend the denouement, lest our lessons scatter like leaves in a gale." I took the chair opposite him and watched as he moved to the small writing table, arranging the pieces of evidence with an almost ceremonial precision. The mica triangle, the paper disc from Whitlock's watch, the receipts and violet-inked notes all lay before him like the instruments of a master artisan. Holmes's long fingers traced each item as if reading a musical score. To him, I realized, the world unfolded in measures of time and pattern rather than words and events. "The lady," he began, still arranging the artifacts, "has observed her own creation, what she believed clever, and has found it restrained by the immutable laws of clocks. Courvoisier has paid for adjustments he did not require, and the Essex Circle will discover that the supposed failure at 13 is nothing more than a rehearsal of vanity." He paused, looking over the mantel as though the very face of the clock might answer a question. "Time, Watson, keeps its secrets better than men. But it can be consulted," I leaned forward. "Then the case is concluded." "Not entirely." Holmes turned to the ledger, tapping it gently. "There remains the matter of motive. Whitlock's death, the manipulation of clocks, the telegrams, all were theatrics. But why the masquerade, and why so intricate?" The answer, as Holmes had already hinted, lay not in brute force or opportunity, but in pride and the desire to control perception. "Mrs. Carew," he said, "wished to demonstrate cleverness. Crane, the scarred gentleman, sought recognition among his peers. Carter acted as intermediary. executing trivial tasks that he believed would suffice to obfuscate responsibility. The lady's veil was the emblem of her control, the violet ink a signature of vanity, the manipulations of Whitlock's clocks a test of the world's obedience to her designs. Observe, each step calculated, each moment choreographed to deceive those whose attention she could not otherwise command. I nodded slowly. The meticulous layering of actions and motives began to form a coherent whole, though I marveled at Holmes's ability to extract order from what had seemed chaos. Holmes moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the dim glow of the street. Observe, Watson, the climax was not in Whitlock's death, which, though untimely, was unrelated to Our Lady's intent. The climax was in the perception of time itself. The message that time will fail at 13 was a riddle, a provocation and a lure. Each actor played their part perfectly, believing themselves unobserved. Yet in their very performance they revealed themselves. He returned to the table and spread the evidence with dramatic care. Now the watch, the disc, the receipts, they tell the true sequence. Whitlock died peacefully at 12:02. Crane's lecture and manipulations occurred after, a mimicry of chaos designed to mislead observers. The parcels, the violet ink, the veil, all were signals and instruments, red herrings to draw attention to secondary acts. Only by noting the minutest deviations, minute discrepancies in dust, the faint scent of oils, the precise timing of actions, could one reconstruct the truth. Lestrade, who had returned with the van and the seized items, shook his head in awe. "I do not pretend to follow it all, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but I gather the lady and Crane have been caught out?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Caught, yes, in the net of their own design. Mrs. Carew will not be punished by law, for no law was broken save by slight negligence and deception in the eyes of the public. Crane will explain to those he sought to impress that timing cannot be bought nor falsified. Carter, well, he has learned that minor obedience is insufficient to escape scrutiny." I watched as Holmes lifted Whitlock's watch, its golden case gleaming softly in the lamplight. "The true lesson," he said, "is in the disc within. Note the time, 12:02, the moment of death, private and unalterable. Everything else, the theatrics, the telegrams, the stage stoppages, are mere commentary." He placed the watch back with reverence. "And so, Watson, we have done our work. The chronometer returns to Red Lion Square. Whitlock's honor is preserved. The public clockwork remains unviolated, and vanity has received its lesson without harm to the innocent." Lestrade nodded, satisfied, though his mind still wrestled with the finer points. "And the lessons for us?" he asked. Holmes's eyes twinkled. "Patience, observation, and the understanding that human pride, when combined with precision, creates a spectacle far more complex than any crime. The investigation is less about punishment than revelation. The truth is a clock whose hands never falter. One need only know how to read them." I saw him relax then, a rare unguarded moment. "Watson," he continued, "it is the delight of my craft to uncover hidden sequences, to see patterns where others see only disorder. And yet the human element, the vanity, the pride, the subtle error, provides a drama far richer than any mechanical puzzle." The room was silent for a moment, save for the quiet ticking of our own timepiece, faithful and unyielding. Holmes's gaze swept across the mantel, the table, the evidence we had laid out, and finally settled upon me. "And now," he said, "we may reflect. Scotland Yard will have its commendation, the Circle its embarrassment, and the lady her satisfaction in knowing that even the most elaborate scheme cannot alter immutable truth. All is returned to its proper course." I rose, feeling the weight of comprehension settling upon me. "And Whitlock?" Holmes's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "He rests, Watson. Let the clocks tell their own story, and let the world continue, none the wiser of the careful ballet of folly that sought to command them." He replaced his spectacles, adjusted his coat, and moved to the window. Outside, the last light of the London day softened upon the river, the city's rhythm steady and unbroken. Holmes's hand rested on the sill, as if feeling the pulse of the world itself. "Come, Watson. We have witnessed the final act, and the audience may depart. Let us retire and prepare for the next inquiry. For London offers no shortage of mysteries." As we left the room, the lamplight catching the golden face of Whitlock's watch, I reflected on the intricate web of deceit, pride, and meticulous calculation that had brought clarity from chaos. Holmes, as ever, moved with the quiet assurance of one who sees the hidden threads of the universe and can at will follow them to their resolution. Outside, the city exhaled in fog and lamplight, and the case of 113, the case time had almost forgotten, had been rendered indelible by the patience, intellect, and inexhaustible perception of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, under a sky washed with the first cool hints of evening. The city, for all its restless breath, seemed to exhale at last in gentle acquiescence, as if London itself were relieved to have time's normal order restored. Holmes set Whitlock's watch upon the mantel, its golden case gleaming under the lamplight, the little disk within a silent testament to the exact hour of death. 12:02. Lestrade had departed with the van and the spoils of Crane and Carter's mischief, to administer justice, or at least to record the formalities of restitution. Hartigan had promised to maintain his blackboard's declaration of Whitlock's truth, and the pawnbroker in 7 Dials would bear witness that even clever theft cannot outpace the patient diligence of observation. Holmes, as if content that the machinery of human folly had finally run its course, turned to me with his familiar, almost imperceptible smile. "Watson, the theatre of deception is always at its richest when the actors believe themselves unseen. Consider the progression. Whitlock dies peacefully, yet is made to appear victim to the lady's jest. The telegrams and halted clocks introduce an artificial narrative. Crane, in his vanity, rehearses the failure at 13. Carter, the willing intermediary, executes the minor adjustments. Courvoisier arrives to pay for services he does not require, guided by the lady's manipulations, and the Essex Circle, in believing they control time, finds themselves deceived by their own pride." I nodded, marveling at the intricacy. "And Mrs. Carew?" I asked. "She orchestrated much of the design, yet caused no direct harm." Holmes's gaze softened fractionally, and for the first time that day a trace of admiration crept into his eyes. "She is, Watson, one of those rare minds who delights in the choreography of intellect. Her error was in assuming her theatre of clocks could escape observation. Pride is a fine engine, but it runs most predictably. Time, when consulted by the patient, yields the truth with unerring regularity. Her vanity brought her to the stage. Our patience has returned her to the wings." He lifted the watch, turning it in his hands with the reverence one reserves for a relic, and continued. "The disk within confirms all. 12:02. Every false lead, every staged interruption, every veneer of mischief has been reconciled by attention to minutiae, by the smallest discrepancies in dust, scent, and timing. The lesson, Watson, is clear. Human pride may shape the theatre, but it cannot alter immutable facts." I observed the faint smile that touched his lips as he set the watch down, and I felt the familiar awe that comes with witnessing Holmes's mind at work, effortless yet exacting. "It is extraordinary," I said, "how every gesture, every scent, every fraction of a second became a clue. One could not help but be swept along by the meticulous logic." Holmes waved a hand with faint impatience, as if to brush away praise. "Logic is merely the instrument. Observation, patience, and the willingness to follow the smallest threads to their source, that is the art." Whitlock's watch, the coil, the violet ink, the veil, the ledger, the disk, all spoke. We only had to listen. And the human actors, they spoke louder still, betraying themselves in each hesitation, each glance, each miscalculated flourish. He sank into his chair, steepling his fingers. The city's clocks, the men who keep them, the pawnbrokers' registers, the Essex Circle, Hartigan's blackboard, all conspired unintentionally to reveal the pattern. Whitlock's honor is preserved, the stolen goods recovered, the misdirection exposed, and the vanity humbled. The stage is cleared. I leaned back, letting the weight of the day's revelations settle. And yet, I said, it seems almost theatrical that the lady, the foreign buyer, and the intermediaries each played their roles so perfectly. Unaware that they were all part of your design, Holmes allowed a thin smile to curl. Ah, Watson, that is the delight of such a case. They believed themselves clever, yet the cleverness belonged to observation, not to them. One might say that the theatre of human pride always performs for those who can see the stage. He rose, walking to the window and staring out at the fog settling over the city. And now, my friend, the watch returns to Red Lion Square. The lesson is recorded, the actors have learned their place, and London may go about its business without interference. All that remains is reflection and preparation for the next inquiry. Time is generous, Watson, and we shall not waste it. I watched him, the evening light catching his profile, a figure poised between intellect and intuition, and I understood again why men would seek him in desperation, and why in the quietest hours the city itself seemed to acknowledge his mastery. "Shall we have tea, Holmes?" I asked. "Tea," he said, with that faint flourish of human warmth, and perhaps a quiet moment in which the clocks are permitted to keep their proper measure without interference. Watson, in our work, the world is the theatre, and the truth, as always, must be the curtain that rises last. As Mrs. Hudson placed the kettle upon the hob, the sound of ticking filled the room. Each clock, steadfast in its own measure, seemed to celebrate the restoration of order. The city's rhythm, unaltered and unperturbed, flowed through the foggy streets beyond, while inside Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes and I savoured the subtle satisfaction of a case concluded, a tapestry of vanity, misdirection and logic, woven together and finally revealed, leaving time itself as the unerring witness to all. Holmes turned to me once more, his eyes glinting with that familiar mixture of triumph and contemplation. "And now, Watson," he said, "we rest briefly, for the next mystery will present itself in its own hour. Until then, let us honour the virtue of those who keep their own time, and remember that no deceit, however intricate, can escape the patient scrutiny of observation." I sat quietly, noting the gentle rhythm of the mantel clock, the subtle harmony of the city's evening, and the calm satisfaction in Holmes's demeanour. The case of 113, the case time had almost forgotten, had been unravelled with precision and elegance. Yet I knew, as I always knew when walking beside him, that London's mysteries never truly end. They only pause for those who, like Sherlock Holmes, are ever ready to listen to the ticking of the world.